North Carolina must redraw maps for 2022 congressional and legislative elections, and the process starts in earnest this week. Joining us to discuss that process is Dr. Andy Jackson. He is director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity at the John Locke Foundation. And Andy, first of all, this process has been delayed a bit this year because of the census data being delayed, but some of this data is coming in soon.
Right. It's we got kind of a first batch of data earlier in the spring, which established reapportionment, which is every 10 years they decide how many congressional districts each state gets, and North Carolina got an additional seat this time around, so we're growing from 13 to 14. But as far as redistricting is concerned, we have this batch of data that's coming out, and they've moved it up a couple of times, and now it's due actually coming out this Thursday, August 12th, and that is the specific data for voting tabulation districts, precincts, that allows us to actually draw districts.
From what I understand, even though that data is now going to be available as of the end of this week, it'll still take a few more weeks before anyone could actually use it.
Right. The General Assembly, the experts that advise the legislators have to go in, analyze the data, kind of get it organized in a usable format for the General Assembly. That'll take a couple of weeks. So perhaps by the end of the month, maybe early September, members of the legislature can actually get into the nitty-gritty of drawing districts.
Meanwhile, the big action this week is about setting the criteria that the map makers are going to use, correct?
Right. There's actually a list, I saw it just recently, of an initial proposal, but they're going to be discussing that proposal and other ideas over the course of the next several days, and probably come to a decision certainly by early next week, so they can work in earnest once that data is available.
What are some of the types of things that will be in the criteria, and what do you hope to see in there?
Well, some of the stuff that they've already had in this initial list that may or may not survive the end of the discussion include things like they want districts to be compact. That's a traditional thing. There's a few ways to measure that, but basically you want districts to not have little jaggy edges and ends that jump out into other districts. For example, they say they don't want to use any partisan data. That includes voter registration data and voting history data, so they're not going to look at the voting history of areas. Also, they are not going to look at least on this initial list, they're not planning on looking at racial data, which is a little risky because we have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. The thing is, in North Carolina, with the Voting Rights Act, there's a couple of areas in North Carolina where there's a sufficiently large black population that you can probably end up drawing a district that is sufficiently large in the number of minorities that it'll qualify as a voting rights district without actually having to look ahead. So we have that kind of concentration. In some places, they really have to kind of pack in different areas in order to qualify as a voting rights district. In North Carolina, that's not really a thing.
One thing that will be up for discussion that's of importance, although it might sound a little wonky, is clusters and county clusters. What should we know about that?
Well, essentially, North Carolina has two competing clauses in the state constitution. One is that all the districts need to be as equal in population as possible, and of course that's also a federal requirement for one person, one vote. In addition, the North Carolina Constitution says you're not allowed to break up counties or cross county lines when you're drawing districts. And as a practical matter, those two things are not compatible. You can't do one without the other, just because there are some counties that are too small to have a whole legislative district. There are some counties that are so big they'd have to have multiple districts in them. There are other counties that don't really neatly fit with congressional districts, so they have this process in which they combine certain counties. Sometimes you would have put two counties together and they would equal to, say, one North Carolina Senate district. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of math and you find out whether we can put these 5 counties together, and between the 5 of them, they equal roughly to the population of 3 North Carolina House districts. And so within those 5 counties, they'll divide up into 3 districts you may cross county lines within that group or that cluster, but you cannot cross any county lines going outside of that cluster. So it's kind of a step one in the redistricting process.
And the reason why this might have some implications for how elections could turn out is how you cluster the counties might end up having an impact on who could win.
It might. And for most clusters, it's essentially a math problem. There's really a lot of them. There's a process you go through. You start with like how many counties can have one whole district in them, and they have to be together. You can't divide them. And then you grow out from there. How many counties would have 2 districts, 3 districts, and then you start doing how many counties can you neatly put together to make 1 district or 2 districts. And the thing is, for most of those clusters, it's really impossible to do it any other way. And you're having a relatively small handful of those where you could maybe make 2 or 3 different clusters. There will be some debate there, but for most of the districts, that clustering process is kind of set in stone.
After the criteria are set this week, I think the next item on the agenda is holding hearings and a discussion about how to do that. How important is that to the process?
Well, it's important in order to get some local feedback, and so it's a good idea. We didn't have that during the process last time around because court ordered and there was a very short time to do it, but we had dozens of hearings back in 2011, expecting us to have quite a few again this year. So it's important. There are some limits because we know that groups are going to be organizing, trying to get their people out there. And so what you hear in these hearings might not fully represent what the local people say. If you have a hearing out in Wilmington, you might have some organized groups getting most of the slots speaking. And so that might represent the various organized interests more than the local community.
Well, as the redistricting process moves forward, one person who's going to be watching very closely, monitoring it, writing about it, talking about it, is Dr. Andy Jackson. He is director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity at the John Locke Foundation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.